My name is Kate Sutherland, and I'm the author of How to Draw a Rhinoceros. Well, the rhinoceros fascination began with one particular rhinoceros. At a exhibit at the Gardner Museum, I saw lots of different ceramic animals, but the one that really caught my attention was an 18th century porcelain rendition of a rhinoceros, and there was a little explanatory note saying that this was Clara the Dutch Rhinoceros, who had taken Europe by storm for a couple of decades in the mid-1700s, and this seemed like a fascinating story, so I went off and started to read about it, and just at that moment I also started a long poem workshop and was asked what would I write my long poem about, and my head was full of rhinoceroses and Clara, so suddenly all of that research started turning into poems. Well, she was known as the Dutch Rhinoceros, but that's because, of course, rhinoceroses don't come from Holland, so that was because her owner was a Dutch sea captain, but she was a rhinoceros from India who he bought, I think, and then transported back to Europe with him, and then started touring around as a sort of carnival exhibit, showing at different pubs and various venues all across Europe for 18 years. I mean, it was Clara, and it was the other things that I was reading about rhinoceroses as well. Originally, I thought I was learning things about rhinoceroses, and then I realized, especially when I was reading the historical material, that what I was learning about was how people had seen rhinoceroses, and particularly at that moment in time, because this was 1742, I think, is when she started touring around Europe. There are stories of the odd rhinoceros that turned up in various European places earlier than that. The best known one was Durer's rhinoceros, so known not because, I mean, Durer never actually saw this rhinoceros. It was a rhinoceros that had been in, that had been described to him, that he'd been sent to, and so he'd done this engraving. But to the extent that people knew about rhinoceroses, that image that he had produced, which was quite a fanciful image, was the one that captured their attention. So when Clara came along, and suddenly, because she toured so widely, people were seeing an actual rhinoceros, seeing what one looked like, and suddenly she was being represented everywhere because she was so popular. She, there was the porcelain one that I had seen that was actually made in her lifetime. There were posters, engravings that were being spread around. She was, enameled onto a serving plate. She was everywhere. So suddenly people were seeing her firsthand, but they were also seeing these images that were spreading around. So it was interesting to see the way that people's perception of the animal changed due to these various artistic representations and what scientists were writing, all these different discourses. I was trying to describe this to somebody, and first I say, my poems involve a lot of research, but that makes it sound like I set out to write a poem and then I research the thing, and then which is not how it works at all. I've always researched things. I like to read. I'm an academic. My whole life is so when I get interested in something, I will read everything that I can about it. And before I was writing poems, I always read poems. I always wanted to write poems, but the sort of conventional notion of what a poem wasn't a thing that I could do. But once I started to broaden my horizons, read more, and particularly learning about documentary poetry and seeing people actually, using all kinds of other sources and bringing in these different discourses, these different languages from different places, I started to realize that actually poems were a great place to sort of explore further those things that I was researching and maybe bring some of the really interesting things I was finding to the attention of other people. I suppose to begin with, it was just the extent to which rhinoceroses are not at all as they have been portrayed. They're portrayed as these vicious creatures, and yes, they have the big horn and all of that, but they're herbivores, they're gentle, they just defend, so there's that. But it was less that and just sort of looking at the lengths that people would go. Probably the a big thing for me was, and this comes in a poem about where I used information from auction sites, where I started to realize all the things that people had made out of rhinoceroses and rhinoceros horns, and it's a kind of perverse and horrifying thing that people made all of these objects out of rhino. But maybe that was I don't know if the most interesting is exactly but the thing that kind of stayed with me the most. One of the earliest known large mammal taxidermies is a rhinoceros, and I've forgotten the date, but it's an astonishingly long time ago. But when I was looking at people who were displaying rhinoceroses, they were displaying them alive and they were displaying them dead. So the rhinoceroses often died quite young. They would pay a lot of money to have this rhinoceros. They'd be trailing it through small villages in England and showing it. They'd spent a lot of money and then it would die. And then what would they do? Well, they'd have it stuffed and they'd keep displaying it, because displaying the stuffed rhinoceros was something which was still of value to them. And it was a way, I guess, to get some return on their investment. But techniques of taxidermy were not that far advanced then, so they sometimes did a bad job. The preservation didn't last for very long. But that's the part of the scientific history, is also the history of evolving techniques of taxidermy and people having a more realistic vision of a rhinoceros when they were able to maybe not see an actual live rhinoceros, but see a stuffed rhinoceros in a natural history museum. And so I was able actually to go and visit some of the rhinoceroses I'd read about, because they're still here, not alive, but in stuffed form in the Natural History Museum in New York, for example, and I think also in Boston. I actually saw rhinoceroses that were killed by Teddy Roosevelt on his big African hunting expedition, which was, well, his conservation expedition, where he killed a lot of animals in order to preserve them in stuffed form for education of people in the future. So it seemed important to me to actually go and see those animals in that way, even though it's also kind of horrifying to me that that's the way that they're still here to be seen. I think that that's actually a really good way to look at history, to actually look at one particular seemingly very individual thing, but then see how it's linked to or emblematic of other things. So when I was digging into the relationship of the West Europeans, North Americans to the rhinoceros, it turned out to be also absolutely about the relationship of people in North America and Europe to the countries that the rhinoceros came from, to the countries in Asia, the countries in Africa, that the rhinoceros came from, to the people in those countries. So it becomes something that's about not just the right, but about colonialism. And you can see that in the details. So there's one poem that's all about all of the purchases made by the London Zoo at various points through the 1800s, their first rhinoceros through to about their eighth rhinoceros, and just looking at where did it come from, what kind of a rhinoceros was it, and you can see the colonial history, you can see the commercial history, the way capitalism's evolving when you see who got it from who. It was gifted from some governor of some province in India, and then it was transferred to, say, somebody who was buying and selling rhinoceroses across Europe. And then you start to see all of these histories. And then, of course, that history affects the present. So it affects not just the present of the rhinoceros, where you're thinking about, okay, it's on the brink of extinction. How did it get here? And how are we all implicated in how it got here? And all of that history takes us right there. But, of course, all kinds of other examples that don't involve the rhinoceros of the result of those kinds of colonial histories. I mean, in terms of what is known and what is imaginary, there's a lot of fun in that to begin with. When you think about people's image of a rhinoceros when they didn't know if it was a real thing, when it's appearing still in bestiaries alongside unicorns. But then, wait, here's one down the street. It actually does exist. It looks like a dinosaur or something, but there it is. It's a real animal. So there's some fun in that. But then there's also the sort of exoticizing that goes on so that you see it being depicted in these various environments where it isn't going to be, or this business of, an African rhinoceros surrounded by Indian people, or an Indian rhinoceros. It's just an exotic creature, and it doesn't seem to matter to the people that that's a different continent. So that's sort of, again, part of the sort of horrifying history of colonialism. So not so funny once you start seeing that going on, or not so entertaining, although certainly instructive. So when I started putting my imaginary rhinoceros, when Clara, I have the long poem about Clara, which is really about her using all the facts as they were known. Then she sort of takes off in my imagination, and I guess I sort of want to free her because I think of her sad life in captivity, so I put her in all kinds of other places. And maybe there's a good impulse, but then I start to think, am I doing the same thing? The other people, am I not honoring the rhinoceros as rhinoceros? From where she's from, where would I like rhinoceroses to be? Well, not in zoos, not in natural history museums, not in circuses, in their own home places, which are now, there's less and less of them available. We hear a lot about poaching of rhinoceroses for their horns, which is horrifying, but we're losing an awful lot of rhinoceroses because we're losing their habitat, and there's not so much people getting excited about that, which they should be. That's, if we really want to save these animals, that's what we have to be paying attention to. How to draw a rhinoceros. Begin with an elephant. Shorten the legs and the nose, pin back the ears. To cement the distinction, assert eternal enmity between the animals. Compare to cow, calf, bull, ox, oryx, buffalo, camel, horse, donkey, goat, lamb, lynx, lion, pig, hog, boar, sow, swine, dog, rabbit, mouse, eagle, duck, tortoise, turtle, toad, dragon, elephant, overturned coach, mountain. Distinguish from fox, tiger, elephant, hippopotamus, unicorn. Use a woolly rhinoceros skull to sculpt a dragon's head. Delete all rhinoceros references from the Bible. Replace with unicorns. Add a dorsal horn and a suit of armor. Incorporate its image into an apothecary's coat of arms. Put a jaunty human skeleton in front and one behind. Sketch a front view, a back view, a side view. Inset details of horn, hoof, ears, nose, tail, each of its component parts. Liken its genitalia to botanical specimens with Latin names, e.g. Digitalis floribus purpurae, Aristolochia floribus purpurae, etc. Picture it grazing placidly in the foreground while a fearsome compatriot gores an elephant in the background. Position it on an island under a palm tree, in a jungle draped with vines, in a marsh rolling in mud, next to a river, in a desert, on a cliff edge. Depict it stalked by an Indian swordsman, or African tribesmen armed with bows and arrows. Don't be afraid to mix and match. Confuse its armor with an armadillo's and situate it in the Americas. Render it with a ring through its nose, being led by a chain, or with its legs shackled. Paint it lying on its side, feeding in its pen, preening before an audience. Divest it of its horn, mask the audience, make it realistic, the audience fantastical. Sculpt it from marble, cast it in bronze, model it in porcelain. Perch a turbaned Turk on its back. Place a robed mandarin cross-legged at its feet. Put a clock in its belly. Enamel it on a serving plate. Engrave its likeness on a medal, a series of medals, suitable for collecting. Emblazon it together with a sailor on a banner, The sailor raising a glass of beer in a toast. Bon voyage.